Hello team, this is Kevin Davis and this is our second discussion board. We're talking about influential women of the American Revolution and I've chosen to talk about Phyllis Wheatley. I taught middle school and high school and I've usually taught in low socioeconomic areas. Most of the kids I taught were usually well below average in reading and most would say, I hate to read. Which I would respond, you would have made a great slave. The master would not allow you to read or go to school. You would just be forced to work all day. You should really appreciate the opportunities that you've got. Phyllis Wheatley is an American literary symbol, and she wrote prose that encapsulated the American Revolution, the cruelty of slavery, and she had a fundamental influence on American literature. And she represents the American dream in this sense. She came from nothing, but with her talents and hard work, she made something of herself, and she enriched the people and the nation along with her. Phyllis Wheatley was a poet during the time of the American Revolution. Considering she was black, a slave, and female, it was totally uncommon for her to be literate at all. Only about 60% of men in New England were literate and only 31% of women. Yet this young black woman would impress men and women in power the world over with the power of the written word. Phyllis Wheatley was kidnapped from Senegal or Gambia around 1761. She was around 7 when she was bought by a rich merchant and tailor, John Wheatley. She took on the family last name, and the ship she arrived on was named the Phyllis. Thereby she acquired her name, Phyllis Wheatley. The Wheatley's children tutored Phyllis in reading and writing, and it turned out she was a prodigy. Phyllis learned English, was reading the Bible, Greek, and Latin by the time she was 12, just 5 years removed from her homeland. The Wheatleys supported Phyllis and had her stop her domestic duties and began to show her off to their friends. Influenced by her voluminous reading, Phyllis began writing poetry. Wheatley, through her writing, proved that blacks could be on par with whites in some areas, which would help disprove the notion of black slavery. Consider this observation by Reverend Hugh Jones in 1724. The Negroes are of a barbarous and cruel temper, yet are they kept under by the severe discipline upon occasion, and by good laws are prevented from running away, injuring English, or neglecting their business. Then there is this statement from Virginia planter Landon Carter. They are ungrateful, irresponsible, lazy, and dishonest. Initially, people didn't believe Phyllis wrote her poetry because few believed blacks were capable, and she had to defend her writing in court. Even after she was exonerated, publishers in Boston were loath to publish her writings. The Wheatleys took her to London, where there was great interest in her book of poems on various subjects, religious and moral, which was published in London in 1773. Wheatley's writings focused on religious themes and famous people. She had written a poem to King George, praising him on repeal of the Stamp Act, and others. Many of her writings would take on the tone that supported the English colonists' mood of liberty. She would meet George Washington, whom she wrote a poem to, and he lauded her with praise for her writing. Voltaire commented that she proved that blacks could write poetry. Thomas Paine reprinted the poem in the Pennsylvania Gazette. She was slated to meet the King of England, but she had to return home before the meeting. Wheatley was eventually freed by her master in his will. She married a free black grocer and they had 2 children. Unfortunately, Wheatley's story ends tragically. Her husband would go to debtor's prison or desert the family, leaving her alone and poverty-stricken. Her first child had died in infancy. Phyllis took ill. Unable to get her second book published, she worked as a maid, but she died suddenly at the age of 31. Her second infant son died a few hours after her death. The fact that Wheatley is one of the first black American female authors sometimes overshadows the fact that she was simply a great writer. Though she was lauded, Thomas Jefferson said of her, her writings proved that blacks lacked imagination and that her poetry was dull, tasteless, and anomalous. Though most critics would agree that her use of the English language was perfect. I conclude with the final quote from Wheatley. For in every human breast, God has implanted a principle which we call, it is impatient of oppression and Pants for Deliverance. Phyllis Wheatley to Reverend Sampson Ocone, February 1774.